Our discussion today is going to focus on this question. Are you ready to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion into the distributed workforce? Are you ready to project your brand as an employer inside your organization as well as outside your organization? The latter for hiring purposes and for attracting people, and of course, the former for retaining the people that you bring in. Are you ready to do that? There are a number of tools that recently have come in that are really useful in helping you to do this. And we wanted to kind of explore a little bit of what are some of these tools, and in particular, one of them that's out there, which, by the way, may already be in your company because this tool has been growing in the last couple of years in terms of its entry into organizations. But it may not be being used as fully as it could be used, and it may not be being leveraged as fully as it could be leveraged by the DEI community. So that's the context of what we're going to be talking about. And our two spotlight guests for this discussion are going to be Brian Vision, he's the CEO, and Jimmy Hall, the COO and co-founders of a company called Culture HQ. And I've known Brian and Jimmy for quite a number of years now. I've interviewed them before. I've watched the company sort of pivot and morph. And most recently, what I've seen is that it's beginning to catch and spread more and more. And I think that there are some pretty good reasons for that, and that there are some really good opportunities in terms of what we could do relative to DEI with a platform like the one that they have. So we're going to have a general discussion about this and all these other topics. But for now, welcome to Sharpening the Axe, Brian and Jimmy.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Joe. Great to see you again.
So let's just jump into this. To start, give me your CNN headline for what it is that your platform does, who's using it, and why you believe you're enjoying such rapid growth these days.
Well, I can jump in here first. So like you were alluding to, I mean, Culture HQ has evolved significantly since we were founded. And I can, of course, share a bit of the backstory. But really today, our platform is the first to combine the power of storytelling with employee advocacy to bring to life a company's employer brand in a much more authentic way. So I guess you could simply put it, it enables a company to leverage the voice of their employees to demonstrate who the company is, what they stand for, and what it's really like to work there. So that's really, like, I guess, the CNN headline, if you will. But the interesting part, and Jimmy can jump in here too, but for us, like you were alluding to, like, we've pivoted and morphed a bunch, which has led to our growth that we're experiencing today. And obviously it's been a turbulent, crazy time in the past, a few years since COVID started, but Culture HQ was born more on the premise of internal connection and inclusion, helping companies to help their employees form more stronger relationships over things like passions, interests, commonalities, and those different types of things. But we started as just an internal only culture platform. And as we sort of evolved and worked with DEI leaders, HR leaders, and then COVID comes in, and COVID obviously changed everything for everybody in a lot of ways. But one thing was very evident. There was a core piece of Culture HQ that was really surrounded by stories and initially designed as a way to bring to life the stories of individuals there, where they grew up, where they, love to travel, and different personal characteristics, capturing photos and videos of employees, initially designed to connect people while they were remote and in a crazy setting during COVID. But one thing was very evident, that once our clients were using that internally and the talent market was getting absolutely insane throughout COVID, they saw a really big opportunity to use those stories to demonstrate their culture externally to candidates, to customers even. And so we started to evolve to really become more of like an inside out company, where helping a company to really demonstrate, showcase their culture and people from the inside out through stories. And that's where we, the story has really taken off in a lot of ways.
I think that, as I see it, initially, you were creating something that was a little bit ahead of its time. This whole idea of let's create a virtual place where people can connect with each other and get to know each other, even people who may not likely run into each other in the hallway, and they can form relationships that help to build the culture. And then with COVID and everything that happened, you pivoted a little bit and began to also support organizations who wanted to display that culture to the outside world and say, hey, look at what it looks like inside our organization. These are the people in our company. This is what they sound like, look like, their backstories, and so forth, so that people outside can also connect to that brand. So I think that, as we said before in the beginning, you've covered the idea of projecting the brand inward, which is a retention tool, as well as projecting the brand outward, which is a recruitment tool. Jimmy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think to your point, Joe, the pandemic really forced this change for so many companies. When you think about promoting people's culture, promoting a culture at a company, you think about candidates coming in for interviews. It used to be, of course, you're going to demonstrate it by walking them through the office. Brian and I, he'll tell you that we met over a ping pong table originally in a shared space, which was like the fun shared space at our office. Companies used to really tout these things on the company tour. Suddenly, the pandemic, in the first couple of years of the pandemic, they couldn't walk people through the office anymore. So the next question was, how do you demonstrate your culture without doing it physically? We talk about it like, if you're a university, how do you get someone to apply without letting them visit the campus? It's a totally different way of thinking for a lot of companies. So of course, everything started to become more digital, and people started to realize the selling value of their employees. So these stories started to become so important. I'm not
Yeah.
going to walk you down spaces at our office, but what I can do is I can let you hear from our employees what it's really like to work here. So the power of the employee story started to become very, very, very valuable during these last few years. And also what we've also seen evolve during the pandemic is the nature of business conversation has become more personal. If you go on LinkedIn now, there's been a marked change from before. You can really see people talking about much more personal information on there. They're telling stories in a really different way. And the professional and the personal world has forever merged with people working from home, hybrid approaches. So just the flavor of how people talk at work is just more personal. And the idea of storytelling lends itself very well to that.
Yeah. And as people that are in the business of shaping cultures and making cultures more inclusive and making cultures more equitable, it's really important that we as DEI leaders become part of that conversation, that we stay involved in that conversation in order to continue to nudge and to shape it. One of the other questions I had for you is, what makes this solution that's being adopted by so many organizations different from using things like Workplace by Facebook, or using Teams, or any of these other platforms that are designed to bring people together for conferences and meetings and so forth? What makes your platform different?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's one that we definitely grappled with before when we were internal only. But Workplace by Facebook, Teams, Slack, they're really all general communication and collaboration tools. It's the main way that employees are communicating to essentially get work done. And so with Culture HQ, there are really two distinct things that separate us from those in today's world. One is that we have that external branding aspect that we were just talking to, that allows content that is captured from employees to be shared across social media, embedded on a company's career site, and many more different channels that can be embedded in. And second is really our call and response system that we created, where Workplace and Teams are much more free-form, open communication tools where people can post anything, share messages, project updates, share files, what have you. Ours is based around prompts that allow the admins or DEI leaders to structure questions that really capture stories in a much more deliberate manner. So it's really those two distinct things with Culture HQ that makes it different. And we integrate with more of the internal tools. But yeah, you can think of ours as a much more structured communication dialogue that's capturing photos and videos and stories that represent the culture, really curated in a way that showcases the company values, the different teams, what it looks like to work in a different location. And all of that content can then be shared externally, Whereas again, Workplace and Teams and Slack is just like an internal communication and collaboration hub.
It allows companies to become a lot more deliberate, Joe. So they can basically focus the course of a conversation that the employees are having. And they do this because the administrators on Culture HQ are basically creating prompts that employees respond to. And that's what Brian's talking about when he says the call and response system versus the free-form written system of something like Workplace by Facebook. So it allows people to steer the conversation for the company. So for instance, implications for DEI, we're working with an organization. I was just chatting with them yesterday. They were talking about a cool event that's coming up at the beginning of March that's going to focus on women in leadership during the month of March. And I said, in addition to that event where people are going to be there, they're going to be consuming information and learning at the event. Let's create a dialogue about women in leadership where people can share their ideas, share their experiences in Culture HQ. So it can be very focused. And what we can do is create what we call a story trend focused on women in leadership and create specific prompts related to that trend that people can answer and respond to and start a conversation with their colleagues. So there's real value in being able to kind of steer conversations. What that also allows leaders to do at an organization is it allows them to fill in the gaps for candidates who are applying because they know the types of questions these candidates will ask. So it allows employees to kind of add their stories in response to what the recruiting team needs. So they know what questions candidates care about. And those things can evolve over time as they have over the last few years. So if they want to talk about working from home, if they want to talk about how people are able to interact with their families more when working from home, different implications like that, the company is able to finally generate content that can fill in those gaps, and they can kind of answer candidates' questions before they're even asked by sharing this content with them in the form of a website, social posts, things like that allow them to reach the candidates and really catch their interest by way of answering those questions.
So you started going already in the direction I was going to take you, which is the big opportunities for DEI here. And I could clearly see that one opportunity is that because it's a call and response system, you can direct the conversation, you can direct the flow of it, or you can start a thread that goes in a particular direction and thereby gets people thinking in a particular way and asking certain types of questions, looking at certain types of materials, which can then prep them for other materials and so forth. What are some other things that you find are really important for DEI to be able to do in today's current distributed workforce environment in terms of projecting certain elements of DEI into the brand internally or externally, or driving conversation? What are some of those things that DEI leaders need to do that a tool like yours facilitates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting where the past few years have changed everything where you're starting to see, I would say, real action happen now from leaders with a DEI standpoint. But I think when it comes to DEI, everyone always resorts to data and metrics because I think, as we all know, like what ultimately matters gets measured. So everyone always like resorts to the typical things to track things like workforce demographics, diversity hiring, retention, promotion rates, utilization of resources, all that stuff. But what most people have found since all this has happened is that those metrics are really insufficient on their own to create inclusion. And we were just reading this HBR article the other day that stated it pretty perfectly, I would say, where it said, in our attempts to create more awake and aware environments, we're forgetting that numbers typically don't inspire us to change our behavior. People and stories do. And so that's where we really think the opportunity is using the power of stories to influence real inclusion across a company, but also to help attract the right candidates into an org. So I think the power of storytelling is such an important aspect that I think people like touch on and have done a little bit, but now with much more intentionality around creating structured dialogue, creating safe spaces for people to share different stories is really important to enact change in an environment. So I think we've seen that already, and Jimmy is working closely with our clients, just like he had mentioned, with those different leaders that are trying to figure out ways to enlist their ERGs to capture different elements of like, what does it look like to be part of an ERG? And What is it like to like make an impact in the local communities around you? So there's a lot of things that you can do with stories that can showcase like the real day in the life stuff that's happening. Whereas again, typically people are like posting in workplace or teams and other things that is much more free form. And it's hard to like really paint a story of like, what are we really doing to enact
Yeah.
inclusion in our workplace? And so that's where you use this more direction, structured dialogue, because it gives the employees much more thought around like, all right, here's what we should talk about. It's not necessarily that you're trying to like, you know, cherry pick the different things that you want people to talk on. It's just like creating a direction or prompt that'll ultimately create that dialogue of conversation and capture really interesting stories that help tell the authentic story of who your company is, who your people are, where are you in your diversity journey, and where are you looking to go. So
Yeah, I
that's what.
like that, Brian. Some of the things that you were talking about, because as I think about a lot of the systems that you were mentioning, or a lot of the tools and the uses that they're put to, it seems like a lot of those conversations, they're very transactional, right? Not only are they free form, but they're transactional. There's never really a peering behind the curtain as to who is that human being and what are they all about, which is really what's important to building a culture. Now,
Yeah.
organizations in the past probably didn't have to give that as much thought. They gave it some thought, but didn't have to give it a lot of thought because, like you and Jimmy met in that shared space where they had that rec room, that was happening organically. But today, with such a large percentage of people working remotely, and all indicators are that's going to increase, that's not likely to happen organically anymore. So all these other
Yeah.
tools that are used only transactionally to run the day-to-day transactions of operation, even when ERGs use them, they use them transactionally. We're going to have this meeting. Should we invite the speaker? Should we use this topic or that topic? That doesn't tell you anything about the person who is writing that and who they are as a human, and the persons who are the recipients of it and who they are as a human. And those are the things that are important in order to forge those human connections, which create inclusive cultures. So I think that's really an important point that should not be missed. Jimmy, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I think you've covered a lot of it. I think the big thing also is when you think about candidates, the recruiting branch of the organization is always thinking about DEI, of course, when they're looking at candidates. And unfortunately, what you see on a lot of the marketing websites for companies is you see, as Brian mentioned, a lot of the static things, numbers. We have, these are the ERGs we have at the company. Here are the names of the 8 ERGs. Maybe there's a photo or two. It's just not a dynamic way of presenting the energy of the ERGs or the energy of the DEI. It doesn't really bring it to life. So the power of storytelling, though, is what is able to do that. So I think companies they'd be remiss not to really focus on content generation, employee content generation around these touch points with DEI. So we're seeing that stories can be very, very powerful when you have people who are candidates who are starting to become interested in your company, and you can direct them to something like that. It gives them the opportunity to see there are people here who are like me, which of course is one of the key kind of mindset pieces that allow people to say, okay, now I want to work at this company.
Yeah.
So Culture HQ, employee generated content, that really helps demonstrate that. It kind of speaks to our mantra, which is show, don't tell. So show, don't tell it has big implications for your website. So we're trying very hard to help companies be able to kind of harness the energy of DEI and be able to project that. One of the things we're also doing, I was talking about the personal element, is we're focusing also on shared interests and shared skills that people have. And Brian and I talk about this a lot, but inclusion also includes commonalities that people may feel as far as things they're passionate about, attributes about them, things beyond just the typical identity features or characteristics that people think. So when you start to delve into things you're really passionate about, it also builds affinity among colleagues and also between a candidate and an employee. Even if they haven't met, people feel an element of trust. They feel an affinity when they realize people are like them, even through interests.
Yeah, it's a great point. The three of us have had conversations about the fact that in many cases, when you start to share stories, you find out that you have affinity with people who you normally may not have thought you have affinity. Like, for example, someone from a different religion, country, ethnicity, racial background may not see their connection with someone from a different group because they don't know anything below the surface about that person. But as they discover more about that person, they create those connections. So that's certainly a good way to also engender those types of connections. And one last thing that I wanted to mention too is that the whole idea of this peer feedback has really taken off in the last couple of years. That's the reason why almost every restaurant in the world is part of Open Table, because people will believe more former patrons of the restaurant who made comments about the quality of the food and the service than they will the advertising that the company puts out. The same thing is true with other types of experiences, whether it's lodging or things like that. Companies are no different. For example, we are more likely to believe someone who we can identify with. And that's where the diversity piece comes in, I think, and is really important. We're more likely to identify if we see someone like ourselves talking about their experience within the company and what's been positive about it. We're more likely to believe that because that person is similar to us, that we'll have a similar experience than the company just putting numbers out and saying we're wonderful and we provide a great place. And that all sounds like self-serving advertising, right? So there's a lot of power to when you get other people in your company who are employees to share that experience. That's power internally, again, with the people who are in the company who say, you know what, I didn't realize that, but now that I think about it, so-and-so is right. That is a big positive in this organization. And I've somewhat experienced it myself. And it's also really powerful with people outside in terms of the brand that you have. Now, I know that both of you, as we mentioned before, have been really busy working with a number of different organizations. So it's very likely that someone hearing this recording may not be aware of the fact that Culture HQ is probably either in their company or is in talks with Culture HQ to bring them into the company, or at some stage therein. So one of the things that I just want to make sure that people who listen to this recording do is check with your recruiting, with your HR and some of the other groups, Brian or Jimmy. I don't know if there are other groups that you want to
Branding. Yeah.
Branding. Yeah. Check with those groups and see if they're already in talks with Culture HQ, because you can then piggyback on that and begin to put your DEI imprint into that tool. Again, it's something that can be really of value to you in terms of helping to steer those conversations, steer those connections, and steer that brand in a way that continues to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in your company. So I got one more question for you, and that is, as you look at these clients that you're working with and some of the work that you're doing, where do you see this future workplace going? Where do you see things evolving from your perspective and from talking to the many people you talk to? And what do you think DEI leaders need to do to continue to ensure that DEI remains relevant and it remains a force that's helping to shape the culture?
Yeah. I think it's a layered question for sure. I think there's a lot of different elements that we could touch upon. And obviously we've touched on a little bit about those through stories, but I think I would say it's certainly hard to make predictions on what the future of work is actually going to look like, given what we've experienced the past 3 years, which I would say has probably been the most turbulent stretch in our history when it comes to the changes in the workforce. But I know one thing is certain, and that is that flexible workplaces are definitely here to stay. However those look like, whether it's fully remote, hybrid, but that is definitely here to stay. And so I think there are many different opportunities and challenges that exist with that. And I would say the challenges are very real when it comes to creating an inclusive culture when people are working from all over the place, whether they're remote, some in the office. And I think one of the most important things is that communication is going to be essential. And where it became a lot easier when we were in the office, you could see the verbal cues, you could stop by someone's desk. There are so many easier ways to connect with people. But when it's remote, it's very easy to not check in with your fellow peers and employees. People can very easily get lost in the fold. So I think that ensuring managers and leaders, first and foremost, are really trained on all the different elements of the policies, the procedures, unconscious bias, all those different things that people need to learn about. There should be evolved trainings of what that looks like, of course, in a hybrid remote world. But I think from like a human standpoint, ensuring managers and leaders are really encouraging active participation and collaboration across their teams. So making sure that their teammates are actually connecting with one another and helping each other and being there for one another. I think being extremely empathetic of people's settings and environments. Obviously, we're all in sort of different settings, and whether we have kids at home, I have a 9 month old, which keeps me busy, and he's been on calls with me, which has certainly changed the dynamic of some demos and pitches that I've had. So it certainly changed the way of work. But I think being empathetic of where people are and just checking in regularly to see how people are and putting the extra effort into building connections with colleagues is so important. And it's obviously very difficult now because you have to put more intentionality around, setting aside time to check in with people. Because I think it's very easy to just jump into, you have a meeting, just jump straight into work, and you have like, how's the weather? How are you doing? Great. Let's now dig into the projects that we have to talk about. So I think making sure that you're fostering that space of dialogue and connection is extremely important. And I would say on the flip side of that, the last piece that I'll mention is that the opportunities to build diverse and inclusive workplaces is really like never before, I would say, because for a lot of folks, you're not hindered by hiring people directly in the office or the location around you. You can start going to places that you couldn't have before to access talent. And so there's still a massive labor shortage for skilled workers, and I don't see that going away. But I think for these companies where the places that you normally couldn't go to attract and recruit talent, you now can do that. And whether that's
Yeah.
for full-time work, gig work, there's so many different things that you can do to try to attract new diverse candidates into your company. And I really think there's a lot of excuses that we once had before are no longer the excuse you can have. So there's a lot of opportunity, I would say there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jimmy, we're going to give you the last word here.
That's a great response. It's so interesting and difficult to predict anything. Who would have predicted what happened in the last few years and the changes that are here to stay? I think from what we're seeing though, and the trends that we're seeing and the success we've had has been facilitated by the increasing level of appeal when it comes to employee stories. And I think that's really that's the world that we're living in now, Brian and I, for the as far as selling our company to clients, and I'm working with clients excuse me, from a customer success standpoint, working with the types of conversations that they're facilitating among employees, and I think that the value that the employee storytelling brings to DEI is something that is continuing to expand, because we are seeing, as we have been working with companies, we are seeing this expand across different industries, just the appeal of the employee generated content. And I think it just has huge value for DEI. It allows people to really share stories, whether they're showing differences from people or whether they're showing similarities as far as interests and passions. These are ways that people can really express themselves if the company values the story and allows them to facilitate those stories. People can now begin to express themselves in ways that they really couldn't before. And like we're talking about with a lot of the remote work, that just becomes so critically important, because a lot of the meetings that were kind of casual and happening in the office just are not happening anymore. So companies have to be more deliberate. They have to use a tool. They have to say to employees, we value this and we want you to participate in this way. And I think that's something that shouldn't be overlooked too. I think this is a big thing that companies forget, but just the fact that a company is using a tool, or a company is encouraging people to share stories, or a company is putting the stories on its website, that simple action alone says, we care about you and we want to showcase this stuff to the world. And by showcasing this stuff to the world, we care about DEI. We care about who you are as an individual, just by the opportunity to share and the fact that we're going to showcase that on our website. That speaks volumes in itself. So compare that again to the static. These are our ERGs. There's a line item in a job description. That's the stuff of the past. The new stuff is our employees are talking about it, and it's being shown in a dynamic way with photos, with videos, with people speaking, and you can scroll through all of this. and you can really get a sense of who these people are. Like you said, Joe, it's really it's like if you're going to be trying to buy an apartment, or you're trying to rent an apartment, it's like talking to the landlord versus talking to someone who lives there. You can say, what's it really like to live here as a tenant? You'd much rather talk to that person than to the landlord who's trying to sell it to you.
Absolutely. Well said, Jimmy. So Brian, Jimmy, thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, Joe.